Welcome back, Time Crunched fans. I'm your host, Coach Adam Pulford. Today we have the guy who wrote the book on maximizing indoor training, and that book is called Ride Inside. And yet again, it's Jim Rutberg. Ruddy, welcome back.
Nice to be here again. Thank you.
There's just so much information between your two ears that I figure we would just extract all of it out.
It's a great way to spend the morning, and indoor cycling has been one of those topics that has obviously gotten much more popular in the last couple of years. And I had the opportunity to write a book with Joe Friel, who everyone knows from the Training Bible books, called Ride Inside, and it's done reasonably well over the time. And so I've gotten to be more involved in indoor cycling than I ever used to be.
Yeah, it is a great book. I mean, when I picked it up, you just get different creative ways on how to implement all the stuff that I think you hear from your friends, you read about in Zwift, and maybe you try a couple of Zwift group rides or races, and how do I integrate their training programs in and all this kind of stuff. So I think it's a cool one to pick up if anyone rides their bike inside. So soft plug for that. Let's first start with just some of the best practices when it comes to our audience riding their bike inside. What should we start to think about when we have an indoor setup and we want to get after it and get sweaty inside?
Yeah, I think, people joke about the whole pain cave kind of a thing, but there really is a benefit to having a dedicated space where everything can be left set up and left connected. Especially now, because in the old days when it was, you set up the rollers in your garage or trainer in your basement or whatever else, and it wasn't connected to anything, it was pretty quick. You could just set up the thing and go. Now with, 3 or 4 devices that all have to be connected to each other and to the internet and Bluetooth and all this stuff, you can, if you have to do that every time you want to ride indoors, it's a 15-minute process. And that's sort of the unspoken the unspoken reality of indoor cycling. They don't really mention the fact that while it is very convenient to set up and it is very easy, it's time consuming. So especially for time crunch cyclists, if you only have an hour or an hour and a half that you can dedicate to riding on a particular day, if you waste 15 to 20 minutes of it just trying to get your setup completed, that's a lot of time. So number one, just have a dedicated setup and find a space to leave it. The second piece is airflow, and heat is the enemy of endurance performance. We've known that outdoors, we know that indoors, and one fan is generally not going to be enough because you cannot replicate the airflow that you have over your body indoors the same way you can outdoors. Even on a windless day, just riding 15 to 20 miles an hour, you get more airflow over more parts of your body than you will with one fan pointed at your face. And the air pocket around you warms up. You're not getting any airflow on your back usually. And what you end up seeing is, number one, power output declines, dehydration. You have a greater chance of dehydration. And then the thermal strain reduces your motivation to continue exercising. So you're just not as likely to do the workout or ride as long when you're totally overheated. So as many fans as you can fit is better than one, is the big thing for setups. The last thing, and I see this
real quick, Ruddy. Jose Nunez, if you're listening right now, I hope you heard that, by the way. Just want to say that.
Okay.
He's the guy that loves to sweat, so he does no fan. He's just sweats hardcore, and the heart rate goes up, and the power's coming down. I'm like, hey, do you have a fan on today?
Okay, so here's the thing to tell him, or the way that I've explained it to people that I think might resonate is that a puddle of sweat on the floor is missed opportunity. That fluid would have done you more good by evaporating off your skin than it does dripping onto the floor. All it is lost opportunity when it's in a puddle. The last piece is where you put your screens. You see these photos on on Instagram and everything of people's pain caves, and they have these screens that are at head level or higher, and the result is the person is sitting way up on the bike, or they're craning their neck. Wow. I think the best place to put a screen is your normal eye line when you're riding outdoors, so that your body position is going to be as analogous to your outdoor position as your indoor position. And part of the reason is that when you do go outside, and we've seen this time and time again as well, is because your aerodynamics are not an important component of indoor cycling, and you could ride completely upright and your power output could be wonderful and everything else. You then go outside, and all of a sudden you have aerodynamic drag, and you try to get yourself into a more aerodynamic position, but you're not adapted to it anymore because you've spent all your time indoors riding upright like a sail, and you're now sore or have less power or all of these things. So I think that it's a good practice to put your screens in the same sight line that you would normally ride, with your hands on the hoods or hands on the even in the drops, for outdoors.
See, even I'm learning stuff right now because I don't use screens when I ride inside. I'm one of those guys. I just stare at the wall. We'll get into my setup here in a minute, but like didn't even think about that. So thanks for sharing. Yeah, screens, man. I try to get away from them whenever I'm not working, so that's why I do that. Those are all like super applicable, really valuable information that I think the audience can apply like right away. One thing I wanted to add, like I know like living in DC, we don't have a ton of space, so we can't have like the thing always set up. Luckily, my wife has allowed me to like have like a bike set up. It has to be clean, right? But like somewhat in the living room. But I've got my kicker like tucked away. But that thing, bring it out, fold it out. I get a little bicep work when I lift it, right? I put it down and take the rear wheel off, put it on, and away you go. But it's accessible. My bike's hanging right there, and I have my shoes right there as well. And so I think the dedicated setup, sure, it can be the luxurious pain cave with all the screens and fans blowing around all the time so that you don't spend time like all that. Or it can be just a very dedicated, simple process of drag the rollers out, drag the kicker out, whatever, put the bike on, start pedaling, and away you go.
Yeah.
So just make it like super simple, spend time with it, be a little intentional with it. And I think that's like the most easy way to avoid all the time loss.
Yeah, and even to the point of it can be a little bit more expensive to do it this way, but if you have a dedicated machine, whether it's a laptop or an Apple TV or something that is in that location, again, so that you're just not having to disassemble your workstation to take your laptop to the thing that you're going to do. Like, it's all of those small steps. And if you have things that you can, even if they're put away, but those are the dedicated bits and pieces, it just makes it easier to do that setup. And to be perfectly honest, it means you're more likely to actually do it. We've talked in previous podcasts about consistency of training and training time for time crunch cyclists, et cetera. And if you reduce the barriers to getting on the bike, you're more likely to actually do it. If it's a pain every time you want to ride, you're less likely to actually do it.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. So once you kind of simplify the setup, I think also having intent with what you're going to do with the session is super important. And so sometimes I have like athletes like, oh, it's cold outside. What should I do today? Or like, it's raining outside. What should I do today? Oftentimes I'd be like, do what's on your training program. Right.
Yeah. I mean,
or, sometimes I do change it, but like, having an intent, I think, is super important. And sometimes that is just follow the plan. Other times that can be like an impromptu, what should I do now, coach? Or an impromptu, I'm a self-coach athlete. What should I do? Ready.
Yeah, I think that especially now that we're seeing that indoor cycling is not a second-rate alternative to going outside. It's a discipline unto itself. It is just a straight-up component of training. We did a an athlete survey recently for CTS athletes and found that 80% of CTS athletes train indoors at least once a week. And there are some athletes who are almost entirely indoor athletes at this point. And you have competitors who are, honestly, you have competitors who are not very good competitors outdoors, but are great competitors indoors. I mean, it's become that much of its own discipline. And because of that, you can change the mindset and look at, how do I use indoor cycling for its best, most well-suited purposes. So for some people, that's intervals, where because you're in DC, for instance, and DC has a very nice bike path system, etc. But a lot of people in urban areas, it takes them a while to get out to somewhere where they can do intervals. You have to ride 30 minutes through the city in order to get somewhere where you can ride for an uninterrupted interval session. Or you're somewhere flat and you don't have 20-minute climbs, but you're preparing for an event in Europe that climbs through the Alps. Indoor cycling solves a lot of those problems because you can adjust whatever course you're riding in order that's more specific to your training goals. You don't have the traffic lights and stoplights and everything to worry about. And then even, I think what's been interesting, especially we've seen it with the live streams of indoor racing, people can empty themselves to an extent that they can't do outdoors, because you don't have to worry about staying upright. You don't have to worry about the rider next to you. You don't have to worry about, the corner or whatever else. So they can really, truly empty themselves. And if you're doing some very focused interval work and it's time to go full, you can really go full gas indoors.
Yeah. And I think that's like some of these like kind of underappreciated advantages of having such a nice indoor setup these days with, trainers and rollers that have even like a better real feel sort of thing. And testing, I think, like, or emptying yourself, right? Like, for people, I get really excited to test people in these conditions because all the other variables are gone, right? However, I still have athletes that, mentally, like test anxiety is one thing, right? But like, I have a lot of people that say, I can't go as hard inside as I can outside.
But I think there's another component to that, especially that people overlook. The rigid trainers, whether it's a wheel-on trainer or a direct drive trainer, as opposed to rollers, and opposed to outdoors. The fact that the bike is being held rigidly in those trainers changes the oscillation of the bike and rider system that you see outdoors. So you're using your hips and your back and your core differently because the bike can't swing underneath you indoors. And that, I think, is part of what changes a person's power output indoors versus outdoors to a pretty significant degree. So we always have people who say that they are less powerful indoors. Some people say they're more powerful indoors, but very few people are dead equal. And I think a lot of it comes down to how much they move on the bike outdoors compared to how much they can move on the bike and how much the bike can move under them indoors.
I also think that there's a pretty significant component of the specificity of riding inside and like that setup, and whether that is like, mentally I'm used to riding inside and therefore I can produce the same power inside versus out, or if you're actually moving. What I tend to find, or like moving like out of the saddle, moving that bike underneath you, I typically find that the harder you go, meaning like sprints and anaerobic capacity, I'm not going to see the same power output inside as I am outside. If somebody knows how to sprint well, knows how to handle their bike, I will typically see peak power outputs outside.
Right. Because there's a skill and technique component to those things.
Exactly.
And then similarly, though, you can, especially for the indoor racers, they have really gotten to the point where they've optimized power delivery to the pedals
Right.
and being able to be steady and being able to drive consistently so that they can make the most of indoor power. And I think they sometimes lack
Totally.
the skill outside sometimes to really apply power to the pedals in as effective a way when they have to actually focus on balancing.
Yeah. And so I guess I'll put it to you, Roddy, since I mean you wrote the book on this, but like from a steady standpoint, and let's just call it like threshold and under, if I mean, here's what I do, and tell me if this is a good way, bad way, or correct way. I'll encourage people to ride inside if I know that I'm going to do some testing inside, right? And give them a couple weeks, right, or a couple months, whatever. But I tend to find that if people frequently, maybe at least once or twice a week, ride inside and we do some intervals in there, I typically find that a 20-minute all-out effort is the same, if not maybe slightly under if they don't get their like cooling proper. I find that a 20-minute test inside is just as applicable as it is outside.
Right. So the athletes who train pretty consistently indoors and outdoors, integrating both, the gap between their outdoor and indoor powers get tends to narrow and gets smaller. The athlete who very rarely trains indoors and is mostly an outdoor athlete, they're going to probably see more of a gap between their outdoor and indoor power. And if they're only training indoors relatively infrequently, maybe there's really nothing to, you don't have to necessarily address it very much. You just have to know that that's the fact. But the conceptual idea that there is something systemically different that you shouldn't be able to, that these powers indoors and outdoors are going to be different regardless. I think that that's something that used to be thought. We used to think that way, but I think now we're realizing that the power outputs should. I mean, the physiology is the same. You're using the same body and the same everything else. They should be about equal. If they're not equal, it comes down to how you're moving on the bike or how the bike's moving under you, some motivational components, temperature, and all of those things are aspects that can be mitigated over time, and those indoor and outdoor power outputs should coalesce, and probably within about 5%. Like the difference should be within about 5%.
Yeah, definitely within 5%. And I think it's important for all the listeners to like really hear that, because I'd say oftentimes with my athletes and the questions that I'm answering is just like, I can't do that same power, for that long inside. And I do think that if that's the case, there's a strong cognitive component to it. So it comes back, in my opinion, to training, where it's okay, let's do some threshold work inside. Let's dial in the fan situation. Let's dial in the motivation situation, which is like music or whatever, entertains you, whatever. But again, like I've been doing this for years, and a 20-minute test inside, will be the same as 20-minute test outside. And to all this other, these advantages that we're talking about, where, you talked that the terrain, right? Like the opportunities that you have for like training availability to go ride Mount Ventoux, from the comfort of your own living room or something like that. Like, embrace that. And even though I don't ride inside all that much, I get super excited because you have this way other like awesome platform to get training done. And people are appreciating that now, but like that's huge from a training component,
Right. I mean, number one, we've spoken a lot about time crunch cyclists, and I've spent a lot of my career, working, promoting the idea of getting more athletes who are time crunched to ride more. Indoor cycling expands the training availability for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. You aren't as constrained by daylight hours. Work schedules can be accommodated. So somebody who is willing to ride indoors or embraces the opportunity of riding indoors as an overall component within their training, not just it's raining today, I'm going to go inside. That rider who may have had 6 hours a week because of daylight hours and work schedules, etc., may be able to get that to 8 or 9 hours a week by incorporating some indoor cycling. So all of a sudden, on a monthly basis, on an annual basis, you can really make a pretty massive difference in terms of somebody's overall capacity and overall workload and overall progress by incorporating 1 to 2 rides indoors as an overall year-round component of somebody's training.
Yeah, no, that's it entirely. And I think like when it comes down to using all of the options and having variety as a component, like as a component of it's a training principle, right? Using indoor training to do that is hugely valuable because you can literally do anything. And I think when you're talking about like me riding in DC and what I have available here, it's like a ton of group rides. We've got some like lumpy rollers and stuff. We don't have like pure hill climbs like close to that area. Up in Frederick, I can get some long hill climbs, but like the social component is huge, right?
Right.
Everybody wants to ride together. Everybody wants to do group rides, and therefore it's usually like high intensity. I tend to find myself using indoor training to just do my zone 2.
Which is hilarious to me because it's the exact opposite in Colorado Springs, for me at least, in Colorado Springs.
Yeah.
And also, I think from a stereotypical standpoint, the scenario that you are describing is not the stereotype. The stereotype is that we do intervals indoors so that we can do endurance and zone 2 outdoors. And in Colorado Springs, for instance, I tend to ride by myself a lot. So for people who enjoy the social component of Zwift and RGT, etc., they can gravitate to indoor cycling for the social component, and you're gravitating outdoors for the social component. So it's different strokes for different folks, and it's great that we can adjust accordingly. The other piece that I think is underappreciated with indoor cycling that people can take advantage of is bike fit. So we've always talked about bike fit being a triad of comfort, aerodynamics, and performance. And when you're inside, you can reduce a lot of variables. So if you're either going to a bike fitter and getting set up, or you just want to experiment with your own bike fit, indoors can be a really good place to do it because the parameters that are being measured stay the same. So if you want to see whether or not raising, lowering, moving forward, moving back on a saddle, etc., how it affects your power output, you can do that indoors and see it very clearly because you can reduce the number of variables that you can't reduce outdoors. If you're trying to get used to an aerodynamic position, it can be helpful to spend some time doing that indoors because number one, you can set it up and not have to worry about traffic lights and everything else, and you can just focus on what you're doing. You can spend focused time in your position and really get used to it. And if it's not working, you're not 20 miles away from home when you realize that you're totally torqued and you still have to ride home in that position, or you're going to snap a bolt 20 miles away. Like there's some good aspects to being in your living room when experimenting with bike fit.
So one quick funny story, which is why I'm smiling here. One of my junior athletes here in DC, we did a training race. You still get upgrade points and all this kind of stuff for it. So I'm talking to him in the parking lot. His dad tells me, "Yeah, well, we got in early for a bike fit, so we just did the bike fit yesterday." I'm like, "Oh, what'd they change?" And he told me all this. I'm like, "All right, how are you feeling with it, Nathan?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, pretty good. This that." I'm like, okay. In the back of my mind, I'm just like jumping on like a 75-minute circuit race with the first ride of a new bike fit. This is going to go great. Well, if you're going to be silly, you might as well be tough. Let's just say that. He ended up winning the bike race, but we get down. So he wins the bike race, right? We go back to the parking lot. He's like, and we had planned on him riding home. It was pretty close, but to get in another couple hours just for training. Mm-hmm. And he goes, he's like, right up here hurts really bad. So I think I'm just gonna, like drive home and then do some training on my cyclocross bike afterwards. I'm like, that's a very smart decision, Nathan. But to the point, it's like, if you make these adjustments, like spend some time like in a very controlled environment so that you don't, I mean, luckily for Nathan, it went fine. Like he's young and can bounce
Right,
back like a
they're
rubber
made of
ball.
rubber, so for 50-year-old guys, that's not going to be the same kind of
Exactly.
result.
Exactly.
But that also brings up an interesting point that we see when indoor cyclists are taking their fitness outdoors, is
Yeah.
that when you're indoors, you don't necessarily feel the the detriment of a poor riding position. Like you can focus your riding position indoors on power output, and you can sit straight up and in a position that's terrible outdoors for aerodynamics and produce more power. So again, bike fit being that balance between comfort, performance, and aerodynamics, you can entirely tilt the table toward comfort and performance indoors and pay no attention to aerodynamics. Then you go outside and you might be very powerful, but now you're trying to fight aerodynamics and that position is no longer effective, or you put yourself in an aerodynamic position and all of a sudden your power goes away because you've been training all winter in a position that is powerful that you can't sustain outside.
Yeah. Yeah, that's huge. And I think when you say like just taking that fitness outside too, like you can really build a huge engine, like a huge aerobic engine, anaerobic engine, like inside. And then the skill component, which we talked about in sprinting, but let's face it, like as soon as you go outside, like you ain't on Swift anymore.
So the
Toto.
biggest problem that it's easy to joke about necessarily, and
I'll
but
joke all day. I got them all. Let me know.
the danger or the phenomenon that we're seeing now is that cycling skill and speed used to develop in at the same time, because you didn't jump into the fast group ride, you got dropped
Yeah.
before you
Right.
were in a position where your skill was going to be tested. Now we're seeing where people have the capacity to get themselves into a group from a physiology standpoint. They can ride with the fast group, but their skills haven't developed at the same time as their speed. So you end up with a very big mismatch between experienced outdoor riders who love bumping into people and are perfectly comfortable with it and dive into corners 3 wide and have no problem, and somebody who has the power to be up in that group, but doesn't have the pack riding skills to be safe in those groups. And I think it's a matter. I don't think it's a matter to be critical about necessarily, so much as just aware of. Both the indoor rider needs to be aware of it and respectful of it, and the outdoor rider needs to recognize that that's just the way it is. And there's no reason to kick that rider out of the group. Everybody has to be cognizant of that mismatch and act accordingly.
Yeah. One thing I'd almost be a little bit more critical. And I think that from the road side of things, well, I'm critical because like, I don't want to ride with somebody who's going to crash me out.
Sure.
Like straight up. Right. And so I think that if you're going to do mass start events, the onus is on you to get your skills dialed in. And then if you don't want to do mass start events, then great. Like just go do your Zwift. And some people might not like me for saying that. But whatever. I want everybody to be safe and happy. I think on the road side of things, we don't have to worry too much about that, especially in the upper categories, because there's like rules against that. But the Cat 4s, right? Like that's where.
Well, but the group rides that don't have categories, you still
Well,
have that problem.
that's what I'm
And
saying. It's
then
like
and
group
then
rides, and
gravel
then
has that problem.
yeah, in any off-road event, because you go into like the Cape Epics, the Breck Epics, the BWRs, all these things. Oftentimes, yeah, I got some like strong European person climbing up next to me like on every hill climb, and I drop them like a bad habit on every descent, right? And then they come back. But so what you do there is like, don't trust them too much, don't follow them, right, when they're going. But I do think if anybody's listening here and like kind of resonates with you, just work on that component, because I want you to work on your skill appropriation. Like I want you to be a good cyclist just as much as I want your FTP to be as giant as possible, right? So I'll like pressure you to both do your zone 4 training as well as your skill training.
Yeah, and I think too, if you're the indoor cyclist who knows or suspects that your power is greater than your skill, is just being cognizant of it when you go to a group ride, and you maybe you're not, your purpose being there isn't to drive the pace at the front. It's to get comfortable in the group,
Totally.
and that's the what you're there for in the beginning. I'm not saying that's always that way, but utilizing those group rides to purposely gain skill, and it might mean that you're not at the pointy end all the time, but you're purposely spending more time in the belly of the group, so to speak, getting used to being there.
And that's actually a really good point, because I was just starting to think in my head is like, okay, cool, I can say work on your skills all day long, but how do you actually do that? And specifically, just to go a little deeper into that already, is a perfect example is if somebody, like, you could be so strong that you just go off the front, right? Get in a break, whatever.
That's their first instinct,
right?
Is, I'm uncomfortable in the group.
Yep.
Riding right next to these people was kind of frightening. So I know I have the power. I'm just going to sit on the front and
and then people draft off you, and then there's no interaction and all this kind of stuff. Whereas how to train yourself from a skill standpoint is don't do the hard effort to go off the front. Stay in the belly, like you said, and try to get a rotation of work going on, so everybody's working together. And that's where you really learn. So I'd say, in a controlled group setting, whether it's a small group of people or like a normal group that's established in your local community, start to work on that. Even from an even simpler standpoint, if you've got like a BWR coming up and you've been doing a bunch of training indoors, like go take that gravel bike onto some sandy terrain, go take it on some single track, go ride all these, because that type of event has the off-road approach where you get everything, and you got to do it on 35s, whatever. And so create these scenarios to work on your skills just as much as this energy system development that we talk about. That's really my take home message with developing that skill work that you don't get when you're inside.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you are fortunate enough to have groups that are kind of that pack riding as opposed to 2x2, very organized group rides, one of the, like training crits, for instance, one of the best ways that we used to have for training juniors and everybody else to ride in those environments was to purposely drop to the back and then work your way up through that field without going to the outsides. And you just worked on finding the little gaps between places and moving up within the field, and you're not doing it in a dangerous or aggressive way, but just working your way through that field. And then when you got to the front, you just swung off and went back to the back and did it again. And it was useful for getting comfortable. And I think that those skills are missing for a lot of folks, and need to be honed.
Man, this makes me, I don't even know how to do it from a podcast standpoint. We're starting to touch on it right now, but there's almost like in my brain, I'm like, oh man, we need more of this, because so many riders need it. And so many riders don't even know where to start with it. Right. But that what you just described is perfect. That's exactly how you do it. Right. And maybe we'll have something like with visuals or something. But that's huge. Right. So thanks for sharing that. I'd say, I guess, just to kind of close out, how to maximize the indoor setup after we talked at length about bringing it outside. Really it starts with that, like having a dedicated setup that's very simplistic, whether it's always set up and plugged in and you don't have to worry about that bowl, or you can just drag it out real quick, have a very easy way of throwing the bike on the trainer, rock and roll. Okay. And then I think also having some intent with what your session is going to be. That applies to indoor or outdoor training, but even more so for indoor, because it's the scalpel kind of approach to training, right? What else do you have from like just a summation standpoint?
I think the summation standpoint really is that we need to, especially for experienced cyclists, shifting the mindset away from indoor cycling is a second-rate alternative to riding outdoors and only to be used when you, for some reason, can't ride outdoors. Shifting from that to this is a year-round viable component of training that is sometimes an advantageous choice compared to riding outside. And so making that mindset shift can be very important for increasing training availability for across weeks and months and years, as well as training specificity in order to get the best work done in the best environment to do the work. So I think that, especially for old folks like me who grew up in an era when you only rode indoors if you absolutely had to, shifting that mindset to it's just a component of training and it's used year round is huge.
Yeah, agreed. No, those are all really good points, and so many more people are riding indoors than never before, and I think it's awesome because it also lowers the barrier of entry for a lot of people, which, like, let's be honest, like whether it's a skill component or just the pretentiousness of road cyclists, the culture of it anyway, like it can be a little off-putting. So riding inside and jumping in groups there, or just doing some interval work because you love getting after it, indoor is a very effective way of doing it and very approachable.
Yeah,
So,
and honestly, we can't dismiss the fact that there are people who feel that they're at greater risk outdoors, whether it's falling on their own or getting hit by something or all kinds of various dangers. And indoor cycling is a very safe alternative for that. I think we're seeing more aging athletes in their 70s and 80s who are looking at it going, I don't really want to be 40 miles away from home, as much, or there are concerns about motor vehicles and distracted drivers, et cetera. And indoor cycling is a very safe way for people to stay engaged.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. So we talked about a lot of things today on this podcast. I mentioned it on a few others, and we've got some of these Q&As rolling out on the Time Crunch Cyclist podcast. But just as a reminder is, if we went over some concepts today, or like maybe we didn't fully describe something, like ask us. In the way that you ask a question is you go to trainwright.com/podcast, and there's a little button there that says ask a training question. Click on that, fill out the simple form, and that gets sent to me or Ruddy. And what we'll do is we'll work on curating answers to that. And we just have like dedicated Q&A episodes all about that. And sometimes I'll even wrap the question into the podcast itself if there's like an existing topic that the question fits in. So it really helps us to know what you, the listener, wants to hear about and learn about. So I really encourage you to do that. And we've had some cool responses already to some of those Q&As of people like thanking us for doing that. But I think it adds an awesome element to it. And if you like what we're doing here, rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, wherever you're getting your podcasts. And that really helps us to like share the show with other people too. So thanks to our listeners for listening. And Ruddy, thanks for being a guest on the podcast once again.
My pleasure.
Thanks.